Powered by the resources of Newsmax Networks, this is a Newsmax election special. The Midterms You Decide 2014.
And it is indeed a special night for the Republicans. Hi, once again, everybody. Welcome in. I'm Ed Berliner along with J.D. Hayworth. Thanks so much for joining us. Republicans and the Senate, they got it. Let's go ahead and look at another outcome, though, if you will, because let's look at the governor's race in Wisconsin. We've talked about this an awful lot here in the last couple of weeks, and this is Scott Walker, and everybody said that if he was able to come through with that big thumping here, that this would set his tone for the 2016 presidential election. J.D., they've called the race here. This is a huge win.
It is a big win for Scott Walker, but the dynamics of the state of Wisconsin, Paul Ryan, the vice presidential nominee in 2008, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens there. One race we haven't really talked about, Ohio. John Kasich, my old colleague in the House, wins going away there. The Republican convention will be in Cleveland. I believe you will see John Kasich make a move, and we will see a lot of governors, in addition to a lot of Republican senators, try to line up to get the GOP nomination moving ahead to 2016.
Another race that we have not talked a lot about, we haven't mentioned at all tonight, is Iowa, what's happening there. Looking at some of the numbers right now, the early numbers, we've got about 40% of the vote that's in right now, they're guessing, and it is Braley 49% and Joni Ernst with 47%. That was a huge margin early in the night. Now we're starting to see some of the more populated areas come in, and Ernst has been able to cut that lead down to about 2 points.
You know, the whole situation with Iowa, 99 counties, a state with the highest literacy rate, a state that used to be really a political fault line. And since Dick Morris accused some of our commentators of soft playing what's going on tonight, understand what's really at stake. Iowa would send a woman to Washington for the first time if Joni Ernst does what the polls expect her to do, and that is to go ahead and open a substantial lead over incumbent Congressman Bruce Braley, who had some real problems assailing the senior senator Chuck Grassley for being on the Senate Judiciary Committee, but horrors, he's not a lawyer. Some people would think that's an advantage to that seat. It's part of the tone deafness that Braley's having to work with, but it's still very close there in the Hawkeye State.
All right, let's tap some opinions right now. Political media consultant Hank Sheinkopf is live in New York, and in Washington, D.C., Republican strategist and political analyst Ford O'Connell joins us. All right, I'll tell you what, Hank, let's get to you first in New York right now and your reaction to some of the numbers here as we are now at 11:02 Eastern Time.
It's like we talked about earlier this evening. This is a seismic shift.
Yes.
Dick Morris is correct. What's interesting to me is what's going on underneath the raw numbers. What kind of people are voting in which direction? And as I said earlier this evening, the Reagan Democrats are not going to lose the last part of that name. They're going to be Republicans. Why? The shift is among blue-collar people, men, a lot of people who feel they haven't benefited from the so-called economic changes that have occurred since President Obama took office. There's a general resentment, a dislike of government, and a reaction to that. They're looking for new leaders, and those leaders, in many cases, tend to be Republicans that they know or don't know.
And it's not only the Reagan Democrats that we traditionally think about in the Rust Belt, Hank. Let me bring in Ford O'Connell to talk about what transpired tonight in Florida. Rick Scott with a victory, albeit by a whisker, and again, what seemed to speak to voters in Florida, economic opportunity, the fact that Rick Scott was making the case for bringing jobs back to the Sunshine State.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, J.D. I tip my hat to Rick Scott. I think a lot of folks thought he was going to go down tonight, including me. And luckily, the voters in Florida realized that Charlie Crist is a chameleon. And although Rick Scott may not be the most warm, fuzzy, likable guy, he's somebody who's managed the Sunshine State in the right direction, particularly with respect to job growth in the economy, which as we looked across all the exit polls, that's what voters were concerned about the most, particularly in the Sunshine State. And I'm glad that Rick Scott won, because having him in Florida is going to be very, very important in 2016 when the Republicans try to broaden the tent and make sure that they win Florida in the presidential election.
Hank, let me go back to another gubernatorial race in Pennsylvania, where the Democrat Wolf was able to win. Now, we talk about the blue-collar voters making a difference, yet in Pennsylvania that wasn't the case. It seemed, you know, traditionally in Pennsylvania you have a T. You've got Philadelphia in the east, Pittsburgh in the west, and then all the smaller markets in the center part of the state. What went on there in Pennsylvania to make the difference for the Democrat nominee upending the incumbent Republican in that state?
Absolutely, good question. What happened in Pennsylvania was the opposite of what happened around the country. People throughout the country were looking for a break with the past and real change. When they voted for Corbett 4 years ago in Pennsylvania, they wanted him to follow the reform movement in the legislature to get rid of the corruption. Remember, there had been a tremendous corruption scandal which he had benefited from. Democrats, largely in office, being accused of everything, using public employees and Senate employees and employees of the House of Representatives for political work, all kinds of crimes, and many of them went away for long periods of time. Corbett did not break with the past. It seemed that he was just kind of moving along, and Wolf becomes, frankly, the reformer this time around.
Ford, we got about 20 seconds left. Let me get your take real quick on what's happening out in Iowa. We mentioned that as well, that Braley holding that 2-point lead here. We're now about 42%. What do you think is going to happen?
I think that Joni Ernst is actually going to pull this one out. It may be a little tighter than the polls suggest, and if she does actually pull it out, we're going to be up to the net 6 seats that we need. And I think that Joni Ernst is really a breath of fresh air for the Republican Party. We have a female who's a military soldier, and I think that's great for the many faces of the Republican Party as we try to expand the tent and bring more women into the Republican Party.
You got that right. Ford O'Connell, Hank Sheinkopf, thanks so much for joining us. We'll check with you gentlemen later on. And also, Joni Ernst is big because she's the first one who brought the word castrate into any sort of a political ad, which will make it perfect in the
But
end.
remember, it's cutting pork. That's what the deal was on that.
Exactly, but still, it was just a great ad. You have to admit that. You have to admit that the numbers are turning for the Republicans. We've got a lot more coming up as we continue right here on You Decide 2014.
The midterms, You Decide 2014, will be back in just a moment.